I don't need a wife. Nathan Brooks folded the letter in half without reading past the first line. I need someone who can cook, keep this house from falling apart, and not ask me questions I don't want to answer. The pastor stared at him. Nathan, you're describing a hired hand. I'm describing a marriage. He set the letter on the desk and pushed it toward the man. Send the reply. Tell her the terms. If she agrees, she can come. If she doesn't. He stood, reached for his hat. Then she's smarter than I gave her credit for. If you've ever watched someone build a wall so high they forgot what they were protecting, subscribe to this channel, stay until the very end, and drop your city in the comments below. I want to know how far this story has traveled. Nathan Brooks had not always been a man who measured his words the way a miser measures coins. There had been a time, distant now worn smooth like Riverstone, when he had laughed easily and spoken plainly, and believed that the land beneath his boots would reward any man willing to work it honest. That was before 3 consecutive drought years had stripped the topsoil off the north pasture and turned his best grazing fields into cracked earth that looked more like the surface of the moon than anything a cattleman should call his own. That was before the bank had come to renegotiate terms, and before 2 of his best hands had quit for better wages in Colorado, and before he'd sat alone at a supper table for so many consecutive evenings that the silence had stopped feeling uncomfortable and started feeling permanent. He was 36 years old. He owned 1,200 acres that were worth considerably less than what he owed on them. He had 11 head of cattle where he'd once had 43. He had a house that needed a new roof on the east wing, and a barn that needed the south wall rebuilt before winter arrived, or he'd lose whatever hay he managed to bale in the coming weeks. What he did not have was anyone to help him hold it together. You need a wife, said Reverend Douglas. Not for the first time sitting across from Nathan in the small office attached to the church on a Thursday afternoon in late May. Not just for company. You need someone who can manage the household while you manage the land. A partner. I had a partner, Nathan said. Margaret has been gone 4 years. I'm aware of how long she's been gone. The Reverend did not flinch. He'd known Nathan Brooks since the man was 12 years old, had presided over his parents' funerals and his wedding, and the quiet, devastating service for the child that hadn't survived its first winter. He had earned the right not to flinch. There are reputable agencies, the Reverend said carefully. Women who are willing. Women who understand the arrangement is practical. It doesn't have to be, I know what it has to be. Nathan cut him off, not rudely, just with the particular tiredness of a man who has thought through every option and arrived at the only one remaining. I know exactly what it has to be. He rode home that evening and sat at the table with a sheet of paper in front of him for a long time before he wrote anything. When he finally wrote, he was direct. He described the ranch. He described its condition honestly without flattering language, because a woman who came here expecting something other than what existed would only be cheated, and he was not interested in deceiving anyone. He described what he could provide: shelter food, modest wages, set aside monthly safety. He described what he could not provide with equal precision warmth he didn't currently possess. Conversation he'd forgotten how to sustain, and any promise that this would ever become something more than what it was stated to be. This is a working arrangement, he wrote near the end. I will not waste your time pretending otherwise. He folded the letter, sealed it, sent it through the agency the Reverend had recommended, and told himself he felt nothing about it either way. Emma Harper received his letter on a Tuesday and read it twice at her kitchen table in the house she'd been renting by the week in Springfield, Missouri, which she could no longer afford to rent by any unit of time at all. She had been a widow for 14 months. Daniel Harper had been a decent man with a weak heart that gave out without warning on a February morning when Emma was 37 miles away visiting her cousin, and she had received the news by telegraph the same way she'd received most of the significant information in her adult life, without warning and without anyone close enough to hold her while she absorbed it. Daniel had left her very little because Daniel had possessed very little, and what he had possessed had gone quickly to the debts he'd been managing without her knowledge. The house they'd shared was not theirs to keep. The furniture sold for less than she'd hoped. Her options had narrowed to a thin corridor in a very short period of time. She was 28 years old, and practical in the way that women who have survived difficult marriages and difficult widowhoods and difficult financial circumstances tend to become practical without drama, without self-pity, with a clear-eyed assessment of what was real versus what was wished for. She read Nathan Brooks' letter a third time. He was honest. That was the first thing she noticed, and she held it like currency, because in her experience, honesty was rarer than most people admitted. He was not asking her to pretend. That was the second thing. He was offering exactly what he said he was offering, and nothing more, and there was a terrible dignity in that, in a man who could have written flowery promises and manufactured warmth to lure a desperate woman west, and had instead chosen to simply tell the truth. She did not spend a long time deciding. She had learned the hard way through a first marriage to a man who had been charming before he became indifferent that charm was not a reliable foundation. Maybe honest indifference was sturdier than she'd ever let herself hope. She wrote back. She accepted his terms. She packed one worn suitcase because that was the volume of belongings she had left to pack, and she bought a westbound ticket, and she sat on the train for 3 days watching the landscape change outside the window and thinking about almost everything except what she was doing. 10. Nathan met her at the depot in Laramie on a Wednesday afternoon in the first week of June. He had not known exactly what he'd expected. Some version of desperation made visible, perhaps. Some sign on a woman's face that announced how far she'd been reduced to agree to an arrangement like this one. What he saw instead was a woman standing on the platform with a single piece of luggage and a composure so complete it almost read as indifference. She was not remarkable to look at. Average height, brown hair, gathered back a dress that was clean and well kept, in the way that suggested deliberate care rather than comfortable prosperity. She looked at him directly when he approached, without looking away, without the nervous flicker he'd half anticipated. "Mr. Brooks," she said. "Miss Harper." He picked up her case before she could object. "The wagon's this way." She followed him without comment. He'd rehearsed something during the drive into town that morning, some brief, reasonable speech that would set expectations clearly and spare them both any awkwardness later. He delivered it on the wagon ride to the ranch, staring straight ahead at the road, speaking in the same tone he used when explaining calving procedures to new ranch hands. "The house has 4 rooms. You'll have your own. The kitchen needs work. The stove draft's on the left side. You'll need to compensate for it. The ranch hands eat at the bunkhouse, so it'll just be the 2 of us at the main table most evenings. I rise at 4:30. I don't expect you to match that." He paused. "If you find the arrangement isn't what you expected, we can—" "It's what I expected," Emma said. He glanced at her. Her eyes were on the road ahead. She showed no sign of distress, no sign of excitement, no sign of any feeling in particular. It was, he decided, probably the appropriate response. "Good," he said. They rode the remaining miles in silence, which should have been uncomfortable, and somehow wasn't. The wedding was the following morning. Reverend Douglas conducted it in under 12 minutes in the parlor of the parsonage, with only himself and his wife Clara as witnesses. Clara had pressed wildflowers into a small bundle and offered them to Emma beforehand, with the anxious generosity of a woman who worried that no one else would think to do it. Emma had accepted them with a genuine smile that Nathan caught from the corner of his eye and found unexpectedly difficult to look away from. The ceremony was brief and appropriate. They said the words that were required. Nathan did not linger over them. He noticed that Emma said hers clearly and without hesitation, which he respected, because there was something dishonest in mumbling words you were legally required to mean. When Reverend Douglas pronounced them married and permitted the kiss that tradition required, Nathan pressed his lips to Emma's cheek, a brief, impersonal contact that was meant to satisfy the form without implying any content it couldn't support. He felt her hold very still. She did not pull away, and she did not lean in. She simply accepted it with the same composure she'd shown the previous afternoon on the depot platform. Clara wept quietly and said it was beautiful. Nathan shook the Reverend's hand and thanked him. Emma thanked Clara for the flowers and held on to them longer than Nathan expected. They rode home as husband and wife in the same silence they'd established the day before. The first week passed without incident, which surprised Nathan more than he would have admitted. He had imagined in the ways a man imagines things he's trying not to think about that there would be friction. That a woman arriving in an unfamiliar house, in an unfamiliar territory, under an arrangement she'd entered from necessity, would express that difficulty in some form. Complaints, tears, demands for things he'd already stated he couldn't provide. Emma expressed none of these things. She found the kitchen's rhythms in 2 days. The drafting stove responded to her adjustments with what seemed like genuine cooperation, something Nathan's own fitful attempts to manage it had never achieved. Breakfast appeared at a consistent hour. The house, which had accumulated a particular kind of functional disorder during 4 years of Nathan's sole management, began showing signs of organization, not all at once, not in a way that announced itself, but in the small, incremental fashion of someone who understood that change imposed too quickly creates resistance. He noticed on the third morning that she'd moved the coffee to a lower shelf so it was reachable without stretching. He said nothing about it. He used the shelf. On the fourth day, he came in from the north pasture to find Hector Vega, his senior ranch hand, standing at the back door with his hat in his hands and an expression Nathan hadn't seen the man wear in years, which was simple, uncomplicated pleasure. Mrs. Brooks sent out biscuits, Hector said by way of explanation, or perhaps just because he wanted to say it aloud. Nathan went inside and found Emma already back at work on something else unbothered. "You didn't have to feed the hands," he said. "I made too many." She didn't look up. Seemed wasteful to throw them out. He watched her for a moment. She was efficient in the kitchen, in the way of someone who had spent considerable time practicing efficiency, rather than someone for whom it came naturally deliberate, attentive, without wasted motion. He'd assumed without basis that she would be ornamental in some way suited better to embroidery than honest work. He had been wrong about that. "They'll expect it every day now," he said. "Then I'll make enough every day," she said, still not looking up. He went back outside and did not permit himself to think about it further. The first real conversation they had beyond logistics, beyond household management, beyond the minimal necessary exchange of two people sharing space, happened on the 9th evening when Nathan came in late from mending fence on the south property line and found Emma at the table with a book and a lamp, waiting without the appearance of waiting. He washed his hands at the basin. She rose and brought food to the table. He sat. She sat across from him with her own plate, which was something he hadn't expected, having assumed she would eat earlier or later, or otherwise separately. "You don't have to wait on me," he said. "I wasn't." She poured water from the pitcher. "I ate late tonight. It seemed reasonable to eat together." He had been eating alone for 4 years. He had forgotten, or had told himself he'd forgotten, what it changed in a room to have another person present at a table. "What are you reading?" he asked. She blinked as though the question surprised her. "Thoreau." He said nothing for a moment. "Seems like heavy reading for a Wednesday." "Heavy reading is what Wednesdays are for," she said. And then, before he could respond, a very faint smile appeared at the corner of her mouth, so faint he almost wasn't sure of it, and disappeared again. He ate his supper and did not smile back, and spent the rest of the meal engaged in a conversation that moved between the condition of the fence line and the price of seed corn, and the likelihood of a useful rain within the next 10 days, none of which Thoreau was likely to have had useful opinions on. When he rose to take his plate, she said, "Good night, Mr. Brooks." "Nathan," he said without planning to. A pause. "Good night, Nathan." He took his plate to the basin and went to bed, and told himself with some determination that the evening had been entirely unremarkable. The discovery happened on a Saturday in the 3rd week of June, and it happened the way most significant discoveries happen, by accident, at a moment when he'd been thinking about something else entirely. He'd come in from inspecting the barn earlier than expected, because Hector had taken over the remaining work, and he'd heard voices coming from the front of the house. Not the sound of someone alone. Multiple voices. He came around the corner of the house and stopped. Emma was sitting on the porch with 3 children. The Caldwell children from the neighboring property 2 miles east, and she had a book open in front of her that he recognized from a distance as a primer. A reading primer. Worn with a cracked spine, the kind that had been used extensively before she'd owned it. The oldest Caldwell child, a girl of perhaps 10, was reading aloud from it slowly and carefully, and Emma was listening with the complete attention of someone for whom listening is an active occupation. When the child stumbled on a word, Emma didn't supply it immediately. She waited. She gave the girl time to work through it, and when the girl finally found it on her own, Emma said simply, "There it is," with a satisfaction in her voice that was entirely genuine. Nathan stood where he was. For a moment he couldn't accurately measure. He had known in the abstract that she was educated. Her letters had demonstrated that. He had not thought about what an educated woman arriving in a territory where most women had received minimal schooling would naturally do with that education when surrounded by children who needed it. He had not thought about that because it had not been in any accounting he'd performed about this arrangement. The youngest Caldwell child looked up and spotted Nathan and said, "Mr. Brooks," with the unself-conscious enthusiasm of a 6-year-old who has not yet learned to be cautious about adult expressions. Emma looked up. Her composure did not shift. "We were finishing the lesson," she said. "They can wait if you need the porch." "I don't need the porch," Nathan said. He turned and went back into the house and sat at the kitchen table and did something he hadn't done in 4 years in the privacy of an empty kitchen with no witness except the sound of a child's voice working through a difficult word outside. He put his face in his hands, not from grief, not exactly. From something more complicated than grief that didn't yet have a name he was willing to assign to it. He said nothing to Emma about what he'd seen. That Saturday passed. The following Saturday, the Caldwell children came back, and 2 of the Morrison children from the other direction came with them, and Emma conducted her lesson on the porch with the same quiet authority she applied to everything else, and Nathan found reasons to be elsewhere. He watched from the barn doorway at one point. He made himself stop watching. Hector found him that afternoon mending tack that didn't need mending. "Mrs. Brooks is something," Hector said in the particular tone of a man offering an observation that is also a question. "She teaches the neighbors' children on Saturdays," Nathan said. "Yes, sir." Hector worked leather through his hands. "She asked me about my youngest last week. Remembered his name from the one time I mentioned it 2 weeks ago." He paused. "Margaret was a good woman, but she never learned my boy's name." Nathan's hands went still on the tack. "I'm not comparing," Hector said quickly, with the careful diplomacy of a man who has been employed by Nathan Brooks for 9 years. "I'm just saying Mrs. Brooks is something." "I know what you're saying, Hector." "Yes, sir." Nathan went back to the tack, and Hector went back to his work, and neither of them said anything further, which was the particular efficiency of men who understand each other. Tulsa. The incident with the rocking chair happened the last week of June. It had been his mother's chair. Eleanor Brooks had sat in it every evening on this same porch for 30 years, and when she'd died, it had remained on the porch for a season, out of habit, and then migrated inside to a corner of the front room, where it had developed over 4 years of neglect. A crack in one of the rear legs that made it dangerous to use, and a wobble that announced itself with a groan if you shifted your weight too quickly. Nathan had meant to repair it for years. He had not repaired it the way you do not repair things that carry too much of the person who's gone. He came in one evening in late June and found it standing in the center of the front room with the crack repaired professionally. Repaired with a wood splice that was cleaner than anything he could have done himself, and the wobble corrected and the whole chair leveled and solid. Someone had also oiled the wood so that it gleamed in a way it hadn't since his mother sat in it. Emma was in the kitchen. He could hear her there. He stood in the front room for a long time looking at the chair. He had not told her whose it was. He had not told her anything about his mother or this house, or what had lived in it before the Silence moved in. She had found it assessed, it taken it somewhere. The Caldwells had a man who did woodworking, or perhaps she'd taken it to town he didn't know, and brought it back without announcement and without expectation of acknowledgement. He walked to the kitchen doorway. Emma was at the stove. She didn't look up. "The rocking chair," he said. The leg was dangerous, she said. Someone could have sat in it without knowing and gotten hurt. He waited for more. There was no more. She moved a pot from one side of the stove to the other, and that was apparently the totality of her explanation. Nathan stood in the doorway for a moment longer than was necessary. "Thank you," he finally said. She looked up then, directly at him. And in her expression was something he couldn't fully interpret. Not pleasure exactly, not expectation, just a careful and complete attention. The look of a woman who has learned not to assign too much significance to small things because small things have disappointed her before. "It's a good chair," she said. "It should be used." He nodded. He went back to the front room. He sat in his mother's chair for the first time in 4 years, and it held him perfectly and didn't make a sound. There were things he noticed in those early weeks that he did not intend to notice. He noticed that she drank her coffee black and very strong, and that she always made more than she drank because she was making it for him before he asked. He noticed that she never complained about the heat, and that she slept with her window open regardless of the temperature, which he knew, because her window faced the yard, and he could see the curtain moving when he came in late from evening checks. He noticed that she had 3 books she rotated through the Thoreau, a collection of poetry with a spine too cracked to read the title, and a novel she kept face down when she wasn't reading it, as though she was embarrassed to be caught with it. Which puzzled him, until he caught enough of the cover to understand it was a romance. And then he found to his significant bewilderment that he was more charmed by the embarrassment than troubled by the novel. He noticed that she laughed differently with the children than she did with adults. With adults, with him, with the ranch hands, with the occasional neighbor who came to call her humor was dry and restrained, a slight shift in her expression that you'd miss if you weren't watching. With the children, she laughed openly without self-consciousness, and it changed her face completely. He noticed these things, and he cataloged them with the detached precision of a man conducting an inventory of something he has no intention of purchasing, and he told himself with varying degrees of conviction that noticing was not the same as caring, and caring was not the same as anything more dangerous than that. He managed to believe this for exactly 37 days. The argument happened on the 37th day, and it started as arguments between careful people often do because someone finally said something true. He'd come in late, irritable, from a day in which the fence on the north line had failed in 3 places, and the cattle had gotten into Morrison's grain field, and he'd spent 4 hours rounding them up in the heat with Hector and a young hand named Pete, who was willing but slow, and by the time he reached the house, he was not in any condition for a conversation of any kind. Emma had held supper warm. She set it on the table without comment on his lateness or his expression, and poured coffee and sat down across from him. He ate in silence for a few minutes. Then she said quietly, "Are you all right?" "Fine," he said. The word came out with more edge than he intended. A pause. "The fence again." "I said I'm fine." "I heard you." Her voice was entirely even. "I asked about the fence." "I know what you asked." He set down his fork. "I don't need conversation right now, Emma." "I know." She met his eyes. "I'm not asking because I need conversation. I'm asking because you've been out there since before noon, and it's nearly 9 o'clock, and you look like someone who's been holding something difficult alone for a very long time." The accuracy of this landed in an undefended place. "That's not your concern," he said. "No," she agreed. "It isn't. But I've been living in this house for more than a month, and I can see when something is wrong, and I've learned that asking makes you uncomfortable, and not asking doesn't help you, and I'm—" She stopped herself. She picked up her coffee cup. "I'm not sure what the right distance is," she said more quietly. "I'm trying to figure it out." Nathan looked at her. There was something in those words, the plainness of them, the honesty of them, the admission that she was trying, and was uncertain, that arrived differently than anything else she'd said. Because he had been watching her manage this house and manage this arrangement and manage his silences with such consistent competence that he had almost convinced himself she found it easy. that this was natural for her, that she moved through difficulty the way water moves through a channel without feeling it, and here she was telling him she was trying to figure it out. "You're not doing anything wrong," he said. It came out rougher than he meant. "I didn't say I was." "I know." He picked up his fork again. "I'm saying it's not you, the fence, the cattle in Morrison's field, the bank." He stopped. He hadn't intended to say the bank. A silence. "How bad is it?" she asked. He looked at her. "You don't need to—" "Nathan." She said his name with a steadiness that was not aggressive, not demanding, just grounded. "You married a woman you'd never met because you needed help. I came because you were honest with me. I would prefer to remain in an honest arrangement. If the bank is a problem, I'd like to know." He set down his fork. He looked at the table for a moment, and then, because she had asked clearly, and because she had earned the directness she was requesting, he told her. He told her about the drought years. He told her about the refinancing he'd done in 1885 and the terms that were coming due, and the shortfall he was currently facing, and the margin that would determine whether this ranch was still his by the time the summer ended. He told her more than he'd told Hector, more than he'd told the Reverend, more than he'd told anyone, because the listening she was doing was the kind that made you want to fill it. She didn't interrupt. She didn't offer solutions he'd already considered. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "The vegetable garden?" she said. "What about it? I've been keeping more than we need. I'd like to sell the surplus at the market in town on Saturdays. The baking, too. I've been making more than we use. There's a standing demand for bread at the general store. Mrs. Caldwell mentioned it." She met his eyes. "It won't solve the bank, but it might help at the margin." Nathan stared at her. "You don't have to—" "I know I don't have to," she said with a patience that was not impatience. He was quiet for a long time. "All right," he said. She nodded as though this were settled and went back to her supper. And Nathan Brooks, for the second time in 37 days, found himself in the presence of something he didn't know how to name and was not quite ready to try. The first Saturday she went to town with the surplus from the garden and 4 loaves of bread. She came home with a number that was modest and meaningful and exactly what she'd said it would be, something at the margin. She set the coins on the table between them without ceremony. He looked at them and then at her. "Next week I can bring preserves," she said. "If you have any mason jars in the cellar." "Left side bottom shelf," he said. 30 or 40 of them. "Good." She put the coins in the tin box on the shelf where they kept household funds. How did the south fence hold "held fine"? And Pete, does he know what he's doing, or is he figuring it out? Somewhere between the two. He found he was almost smiling. Like most people. She looked at him then, directly the way she sometimes did, with that careful, complete attention, and Nathan Brooks understood, standing in his own kitchen on a Saturday evening in late June, that the 37th day had already passed, and the 38th was underway, and the careful distance he'd been maintaining between noticing and caring had already become, at some point, without his noticing, something that was neither. He didn't say this. He wasn't anywhere near ready to say this. But he sat down at the table and poured himself more coffee and asked Emma to tell him what Mrs. Caldwell had said about the bread demand at the general store, and she sat down across from him and told him. And outside the window, the Wyoming sky went dark in the particular slow way it does in summer, and the ranch that had been silent for 4 years held for the first time the sound of 2 people talking about ordinary things in the tone of people who have begun, without deciding to trust each other. Neither of them would have called it love, but they would both remember this evening, this specific evening, with the coins on the table and the mason jars in the cellar, and the coffee going cool between them, as the evening when something shifted in the air of the house, permanent and quiet. The way the first real rain of summer shifts everything without announcing what it's changed. The mason jars were on the left side bottom shelf, exactly where Nathan said they would be. Emma found 34 of them cleaned and stacked with the particular care of a woman who had kept house before her. Someone who understood that order in a cellar meant something, that preparation was its own form of love. She ran her thumb along the rim of one jar, and thought about Eleanor Brooks, who she'd never met, and whose rocking chair she now heard creaking some evenings when Nathan thought no one was listening. She didn't mention the jars to him. She simply started filling them. That was the week of July 4th, and by the time the holiday passed, she had 14 jars of strawberry preserves lined up on the kitchen shelf, 6 of apple butter from the dried stock in the cellar, and a standing order from Greta Hollis at the Laramie General Store for 24 loaves of bread across the next month, payable on delivery. Nathan saw the jars on a Tuesday morning when he came in for coffee. He stopped. He looked at them for a long moment. 14, he said. 18 by end of week, Emma said. Greta wants the apple butter specifically. Apparently her last supplier moved to Denver. Nathan poured his coffee. He turned to look at the jars again, then at Emma, then back at the jars with the expression of a man recalibrating a calculation he'd thought was settled. You've been busy, he said. The mornings are long, she said, and preserves don't require conversation. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was in the neighborhood of one. He took his coffee outside, and Emma permitted herself a small private smile, directed at no one. It was Hector who first said aloud what the ranch hands had been saying among themselves for 2 weeks. He found Pete Morrison, who was young enough to be genuinely confused about what he was observing, leaning on the fence of the south paddock on a Wednesday afternoon, watching Nathan Brooks fix a water trough that had been broken for 3 years. He never fixed that before, Pete said. No, Hector agreed. Why's he fixing it now? Hector watched Nathan work for a moment, the focused, deliberate way he was going at it, the absence of the dragging fatigue that had characterized the man's movements for as long as Hector had known him. Mrs. Brooks mentioned the horses were favoring their water from the main barn over the paddock trough, Hector said. Said it probably meant something was wrong with it. Pete chewed on this. She noticed that. She notices everything, Hector said. She just doesn't say it like an accusation. Pete looked at the trough. He looked at Nathan. Is that why he's fixing it? Because she mentioned it. Pete, Hector said with the patience of a man who has been in the world considerably longer. Has anyone ever noticed things you didn't know, you needed, noticed? Pete thought about it. My mother, he said eventually. Yes, Hector said. Exactly. Emma did not set out to change things. That was the truth she would have told anyone who asked, and it was the kind of truth that contained other truths inside it, because she hadn't set out to change things, and things were changing, and she wasn't unhappy about that, and the not unhappiness was itself a thing she hadn't expected. What she'd expected when she stepped off the train in Laramie was survival. A stable roof, enough to eat. Safety of a manageable and predictable kind, which was different from happiness, but not incompatible with dignity. And dignity was what she'd set as her floor when she'd packed the single suitcase and bought the westbound ticket. She had not expected Nathan Brooks. Not specifically him. Not the way he moved through his own house with the careful restraint of a man who has trained himself not to want things from it. Not the way he absorbed her small changes without comment, the coffee at the lower shelf, the curtains she'd let down to their full length, the kitchen table she'd shifted 3 inches toward the window, so the morning light fell on it differently, absorbing them with the quiet of a man who notices but has no vocabulary for saying so. She had not expected to find herself on a Friday morning in the second week of July, standing in front of the old curtains in the front room and understanding with a clarity that surprised her that what she was doing when she repaired them was not just mending fabric. She was trying to give this house permission to become a home again. And that the wanting of that, the actual genuine wanting of it, had arrived without her consent at some point in the last 6 weeks. She took the curtains down and repaired them at the kitchen table, and hung them back while Nathan was in the north field, and when he came in that evening, he looked at them for a moment from the doorway. You fixed them, he said. The hem was coming loose, she said. They're good curtains. They were just unattended. He looked at her in the particular way he had direct assessing slower than it appeared. A lot of things around here have been unattended, he said. I noticed, she said. I'm working on it. And there it was again, that almost sound from him, that neighboring country of a laugh. The children came every Saturday without fail now, and their number had grown. What had started with the 3 Caldwell children had expanded to include 2 Morrison children, a girl named Lily, whose family had arrived from Ohio the previous autumn, and who was both extremely bright and completely unschooled. And this was the one that surprised Emma, a 14-year-old boy named Cal, whose parents worked the Dawson spread, and who came not because his parents insisted, but because he'd heard about it, and walked 2 miles to ask Emma with excruciating teenage dignity whether there was an age limit. "No age limit," Emma had said. "I'm behind," he said. "I can read, but I can't. I can read, but not well. And arithmetic. Sit down, Cal." He'd sat down and hadn't missed a Saturday since. Nathan had watched this evolution from the deliberate distance he'd been maintaining. He was good at distance. He'd been practicing it for 4 years. But distance has a limited effectiveness when the thing you're distancing yourself from is happening 20 feet away on your own porch. And one Saturday in the middle of July, he found himself at the edge of the porch, not for any reason he could justify, but simply because he was there. Cal was working through a long division problem on a slate board, and he was getting it wrong in the same place. He always got it wrong, and Emma was watching him not get it again with the expression of a woman deciding whether to tell him or let him find it himself. "Same place," Nathan said. Emma looked up. Cal looked up. "You carry the one too early," Nathan said to Cal. "Do the subtraction first and then decide if you're carrying." Cal stared at him. Emma's expression had shifted to something careful and intent. Cal looked back at his slate. He erased. He did it again, this time, subtraction first. He got it. He looked up at Nathan with the wide, startled expression of a boy who has just had a door opened he didn't know existed. "That's," Cal said, "that's what I was doing wrong." "Every time," Nathan said. A pause. Emma was very still. "Can you—" Cal hesitated with the careful pride of a 14-year-old. "Do you know a lot of arithmetic?" Nathan looked at the slate board, then at Cal, then briefly at Emma, whose expression he couldn't read and didn't try to. "Enough," Nathan said. "Move over." He sat down on the porch step beside Cal, took the chalk from his hand, and spent the next 40 minutes teaching long division to a 14-year-old boy, while 5 younger children watched with the fascinated attention that children pay to unexpected things. Emma said nothing the entire time. When Nathan finally rose, dusted chalk from his hands, and walked back toward the barn, without looking at her, she permitted herself to watch him go. She permitted herself to think, there he is. Not the man he'd decided to be, not the version of himself he'd constructed out of grief and drought and solitary years. The one underneath. She didn't say this to anyone. She turned back to the children and continued the lesson. But she held the thought with both hands the whole rest of that afternoon. July moved into August the way it does in Wyoming. Fast at the surface, slow underneath the heat, sitting on everything like a judgment. The hay cutting went well enough. The cattle were holding weight. The bank was still a presence at the edge of Nathan's thinking. The way a chronic ache is a presence not acute enough to stop everything, persistent enough to prevent forgetting. He told Emma this on a Tuesday evening, because telling her had become, without his explicit decision, a thing that he did. "The Hendersons defaulted last spring," he said. "Best farm in the valley. Went to auction in April." "I heard," Emma said. She was mending something. Cal had torn a shirt and left it with her, which Nathan had noticed without commenting on. "Are you at that kind of risk?" "Not yet." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "If we get a good hay yield and the cattle price holds through fall, we're not at that risk. If one of those fails—" He stopped. "Then we work harder on what we can control," Emma said. It wasn't comfort exactly. It was something more useful than comfort. It was a clear-eyed acknowledgement of where they stood that didn't pretend the difficulty wasn't real and didn't collapse under the weight of it either. "The bread sales," he said. $42.60 since I started," she said. He looked at her. I keep records, she said without apology. I know. He'd found the ledger. Small, neat handwriting, every sale noted, every expense against it, tracked to the cent. It had been sitting on the kitchen shelf between her Thoreau and the Cracked Spine poetry collection, and he'd picked it up, assuming it was a journal, and found a financial record so precise it would have satisfied any bank examiner. You could have been an accountant. I was a teacher, she said. Before Daniel. I taught in Springfield for 3 years. He went still. You never said that. You never asked? He thought about this. He thought about a woman who had been a teacher arriving in a territory where ranch children were growing up without schooling and quietly starting classes on her porch, without announcement, without credit, without even telling her husband what she'd been before she became his wife. Why did you stop? He asked. When you married? Daniel didn't think it was appropriate, she said. The simplicity of it, the absence of drama in the way she said it. That seems like a waste, Nathan said. Emma looked at him. Something shifted in her face, not dramatically, not with tears, but in the small way of a person who has been given back something they didn't realize they'd been missing. Yes, she said. It was. The first time Nathan brought her something was 3 weeks into August, and it was not a grand gesture because Nathan Brooks was not constituted for grand gestures, and Emma, who had survived a first husband, constituted almost entirely for grand gestures that preceded long silences, was not sure she could have borne one. He came in from a Thursday supply run to Laramie with the usual feed flour, a new hinge for the cellar door, and set one additional item on the kitchen table. A small wrapped package. The paper was the brown wrapping kind from the general store, folded with the unsentimental precision of someone who had wrapped a practical purchase. Emma looked at it. She looked at him. Greta Hollis said you'd been admiring it. He said to the window frame, not to her. She unwrapped it. It was a book. A collection of American poetry. A different one. Not the Cracked Spine one she read from, but a newer edition. The spine intact, the pages clean. She'd mentioned to Greta in passing on her last delivery run that her copy of the Whitman was falling apart. She hadn't thought Greta was paying attention. She hadn't thought Nathan would be told. She held the book with both hands. You didn't have to do that, she said. I know, he said. A silence. Thank you, she said. He nodded at the window frame. Greta sends her regards. And then he picked up the new hinge and went to fix the cellar door, and Emma stood in the kitchen holding a book of poetry and understanding that something had just happened that was not in either of their original terms, and that neither of them was going to acknowledge it directly, and that the not acknowledging was its own kind of language she was beginning to learn. The night the storm hit was the 14th of August. It came fast, the way Wyoming storms do. No slow buildup, just a sudden shift in the air pressure, and then the wind, and then the lightning moving across the sky in sheets, and Nathan was already up and moving before Emma reached the kitchen doorway. South barn, he said, pulling on his coat. The new hay if the roof gives... Go, she said. I'll check the east fence line light. He stopped for half a second. You don't need to... Nathan. She already had her coat off the hook. Go. He went. She went to the east fence line lantern, which had a habit of going out in high wind, and which, if it went out, meant any cattle spooked by the storm might push through the fence in the dark without anyone knowing until morning. She'd noticed this vulnerability 3 weeks ago and had mentioned it to Nathan, and they'd agreed the lantern was a temporary solution until Pete could repair the section properly. Tonight the lantern was intact. She braced it and made sure it would hold and came back to the house and put on coffee and was standing at the stove when Nathan came in 30 minutes later, soaked through with hay in his hair and the particular expression of a man who has just done something physically exhausting and found the outcome acceptable. Held, he said. Good, she said. Sit down. He sat. She brought him coffee and a towel, and he sat at the kitchen table dripping on the floor with the steam rising off his coffee, and she sat across from him because it was nearly midnight and she wasn't going back to sleep, and outside the storm was still running its course. The east light, he asked. Still up, she said. I braced it. He looked at her. wet hair coat still on, sitting across from him at midnight in the middle of a storm, like it was the most natural thing in the world to be doing. "You didn't have to go out there," he said. "I know the fence line," she said. "I've walked it twice. I knew where the problem was." "Emma." "The coffee's getting cold," she said. He drank his coffee. She drank hers. The storm rattled the windows and eventually moved east, and they sat at the kitchen table at 1 in the morning in the particular quiet that follows storms. And neither of them said anything more about it. And both of them knew that what had happened in the last 2 hours was not the same thing as what had been happening in the weeks before. Something had moved. Something had decided. Nathan set down his empty cup. "You checked the east fence line in the dark in the middle of a lightning storm," he said. "Yes." "Because you noticed a vulnerability 3 weeks ago." "Yes." A very long pause. "Emma." His voice had changed. The careful management of it had changed. "Why did you really come to Wyoming?" She looked at him steadily. "I told you why. I know what you told me." That was the practical answer. He met her eyes with the directness of a man who has run out of the energy required to look sideways. "I'm asking the other one." The kitchen was very quiet. "Because you were honest," she said. "Because your letter was the only letter I received that didn't promise me something. Every other man wrote about love and futures and beautiful land and happiness." She paused. "You wrote about a drafting stove and a house that needed a new roof." He said nothing. "I had already learned," she continued quietly, "that the men who promise beautiful things tend to be protecting themselves from having to deliver them. You didn't promise me anything, so I thought—" She stopped. "I thought whatever you could actually give would be real." The silence stretched. "And has it been?" he asked. "Real?" She looked at him for a long moment. "Yes," she said. "More than I expected." Nathan Brooks sat with that for a moment that seemed longer than it was. Outside, the last of the storm was moving through, and the air coming in under the door was cool now, washed clean, smelling of wet grass and fresh starts. "I should have told you earlier," he said, "that you're—" He stopped, looked at the table, started again. "That this arrangement has been better than I gave it credit for being." Emma smiled. Not the small, restrained smile she kept in reserve for public use. The real one, the one he'd seen directed at the children on the porch. The one that changed her face. "High praise," she said. "Don't push it," he said. She laughed. Genuinely quietly sitting across from him at 1 in the morning, with her coat still on and her coffee cooling between her hands. And Nathan Brooks heard that laugh land somewhere in the middle of his chest and stay there. And he looked at the table and did not permit himself to examine what that meant. But he filed it in the same place he'd been filing all the other things. The mason jars, the rocking chair, the chalk on his hands that Saturday afternoon, the east fence line in a lightning storm. The file was getting full. He was going to have to open it eventually. He just wasn't ready yet. What happened the following week arrived without warning, the way the decisive things tend to arrive. It started with a conversation Nathan was never meant to hear. He'd ridden into Laramie on a Thursday to settle an account at the feed store and was cutting through the alley beside the dry goods store on his way back to the wagon when he caught his own name from the other side of the wall. 2 women's voices, unhurried, not attempting to be quiet, because they had no reason to believe anyone who mattered was within earshot. "Brooks woman," the first voice said. "Emma, they're calling her now. Mail order." The second voice carried the particular texture of a word deployed as a verdict. "You know the kind. They go where the money is." Nathan's money's not exactly impressive. It's land. Land is enough when you've got nothing. Still, poor man thinks she's there because she wants to be. She's there because she had no options left. A pause. The first voice again, with something almost like sympathy, that was actually just a softer version of the same cruelty. "Margaret was a real wife. This one's just practical." Nathan stood in the alley. He had heard worse. He had heard worse about himself, about the ranch, about Margaret's death, and what it had done to him, about the choices he'd made in the years since. He had a tolerance for what the town's gossip could produce. But he stood in the alley for a long moment with both hands and fists at his sides and understood that what he was feeling was not the detached irritation of a man defending his reputation. It was something more immediate than that, more specific. He was angry on her behalf. He rode home and said nothing. Emma was in the kitchen when he arrived mid-afternoon earlier than she expected him. She looked up. "Everything all right at the feed store?" "Fine," he said. She looked at him for a fraction longer than usual. She had learned to read the particular frequencies of his silences. "Nathan." "It's fine," he said. "I'm going to check the south fence." He went to the south fence even though the south fence was fine, and he knew it was fine, and he stayed there for an hour, doing nothing useful, which was not something Nathan Brooks did, and when he came back, he was calmer but not settled. He stood in the kitchen doorway that evening and watched Emma move through the space she'd made functional and warm, and entirely her own in 2 months, and he thought about 2 women in an alley making her small, making her into a category mail-order practical, no options left, and he thought about the east fence line in the lightning storm, and the mason jars, and the chalk on his hands, and the ledger with $42.60 recorded to the penny. And he thought about the book of Whitman on the kitchen shelf, and the children on the porch every Saturday, and the rocking chair held solid in the front room. He thought about all of it. "Emma," he said. She turned. "I want you to know—" He stopped. He tried again. "What you've done here. For this ranch, for the hands, for those children." He looked at her directly. "It's not small." Emma went very still. "Nathan, I'm not finished." He hadn't known he was going to say this, and now that he'd started, he was committed to the end of it. "When I wrote that letter, I thought I was solving a problem. I thought this was an arrangement, a transaction." He paused. "I was wrong about what it was going to be." The kitchen was very quiet. "What is it?" she asked. He met her eyes. "I don't know yet," he said honestly. "But it's not a transaction." Emma looked at him for a long moment. "No," she said. "It's not." They stood in the kitchen with several feet of floor between them, and something significantly less than that between everything else, and the evening moved on. The way Wyoming evenings do, slowly, at first. Then all at once. And Nathan Brooks understood with a clarity that was almost violent in its precision that the file he'd been filling was not going to stay closed much longer. He didn't say this. He wasn't ready to say this. But he thought soon. And across the kitchen, Emma Harper Brooks, who had survived 1 marriage and 1 widowhood, and 3 days on a westbound train, and 2 months of careful distance, thought the same word at approximately the same moment. Soon. The word soon had no fixed address. That was what Emma discovered in the days that followed. That the thing she'd felt standing in the kitchen with Nathan, that mutual understanding of soon, had no practical location in either of their lives. It existed in the space between them, warm and unresolved, and both of them moved around it with the careful precision of people who have learned from experience that the things you reach for too quickly tend to break. So they didn't reach. They worked. Nathan rode with her to Laramie on her Saturday delivery runs twice in August, and Emma did not ask him to, and he did not explain himself. He simply appeared at the wagon when she was loading it and took the heavier crates without comment. The first time it happened, she looked at him and he looked at the crate, and they both understood that nothing needed to be said about it. Greta Hollis at the general store noticed, and the particular way she noticed the careful avoidance of any expression at all, told Emma that Greta had noticed something worth noticing. Cal had started coming by on Wednesday afternoons, as well as Saturdays, ostensibly for help with the arithmetic that Nathan had inadvertently introduced him to, and Nathan had taken to being present for these sessions in the same way he took to being present for things he wasn't willing to admit he valued. He'd appear in the doorway. He'd sit on the porch step. He'd correct Cal's long division with the same blunt efficiency he applied to everything else, and then stand up and leave, as though he'd just wandered through. Cal mentioned to Pete Morrison that Mr. Brooks was a real good teacher when he wasn't trying to be. Pete mentioned this to Hector, who said nothing but smiled in a way that carried considerable content. The ranch was producing at a level it hadn't reached in 3 years. The hay yield had come in strong, not exceptional, but enough, and Emma's market sales had accumulated to a sum that added to the cattle revenue pushed Nathan's margin past the threshold he'd been watching with the anxious attention of a man who knows exactly where the floor is and exactly how far he is from it. He told her the numbers on a Friday evening in late August, sitting at the kitchen table with the ledger open between them. His ledger, the ranch accounts which he'd never shared with anyone. And Emma sat across from him and followed the numbers with the same focused attention she gave to everything. And when he showed her the September projection, she looked up with an expression so carefully controlled that he understood it was controlled because the alternative was something she wasn't ready to show him. "You're going to make it through fall," she said. "We're going to make it through fall," he said. Emma looked at the ledger for a moment. "Yes," she said. "We." It was Pete who found the letter. That was the thing no one could have predicted, that the instrument of disruption would be a 19-year-old ranch hand with no more malice in him than a well-meaning retriever who doesn't understand the value of what he's carrying. It was a Wednesday, and Pete had gone to the main house to return a tool he'd borrowed, and Emma wasn't home. She'd walked to the Caldwell place with some preserves, and the door was open the way it always was. In good weather, and Pete had stepped inside just far enough to set the tool down on the hall table and knocked over the small stack of mail that had arrived Tuesday from Laramie. He'd gathered it back up without looking at it the way you do, and one envelope had landed face up, and Pete's eyes had caught it before his manners could stop them. He didn't know the name on the return address, Harrington, a law firm in Missouri, but he knew the legal seal impressed into the wax because his father had received a letter with a similar seal when a land dispute went to litigation, and the memory of his father's face when that letter arrived had never fully left him. Pete set the mail back on the table and took his tool and went to find Hector. "There was a lawyer's letter," he said. "For Mrs. Brooks, from Missouri." Hector looked at him. "I wasn't snooping," Pete said quickly. "I knocked it over, and the seal it looked like." "All right, Pete. Do you think she's in trouble?" Hector was quiet for a moment. "I think that's none of our business." "But if she's—" "Pete." Hector's voice was not unkind, but it was final. "Leave it." Pete left it. But Hector stood for a long moment after Pete walked away, looking at the main house, thinking about a woman who'd arrived with one suitcase and had, in the space of 3 months, made herself as necessary to this place as water. Emma received the letter that afternoon. She recognized the seal before she opened it. Harrington and Graves had handled Daniel's estate, and the last communication she'd received from them had been the letter informing her that the debts exceeded the assets and she should expect nothing. She'd filed that letter underclosed in her mind and had not revisited the file. She opened this one standing in the hallway, still holding the empty preserves basket. It took her 2 readings to fully absorb what it said. Daniel's uncle, a man named Gerald Harper, who she had met exactly twice at the wedding and at Daniel's funeral, and who had barely spoken to her either time, had died in May. Gerald Harper had been, as it turned out, considerably wealthier than anyone in Daniel's immediate family had known. He had investments in St. Louis property in Kansas City, and a portfolio that a Missouri law firm was now in the process of distributing according to his will. The will named Emma, not as a primary beneficiary. There were cousins, a charitable endowment, but as a secondary beneficiary to a substantial sum. Enough. More than enough. More than she had been able to imagine having access to at any point in her adult life. The letter requested her response and her intentions within 60 days. Emma stood in the hallway for a long time. She thought about Springfield, about the house she'd rented by the week, about the westbound ticket and the single suitcase, and the 3 days on the train when she'd talked herself into believing that practical arrangements could be enough. She thought about Nathan standing in the kitchen saying, "It's not a transaction." She thought about the rocking chair. She put the letter in the drawer of her nightstand and went to start supper and did not tell anyone because she did not know yet what there was to tell. She should have told Nathan that evening. She understood this clearly sitting across from him at supper, watching him talk about the fall cattle drive with the slightly unlocked ease that had replaced the rigid management of his early weeks. The ease of a man who has remembered slowly and against his own resistance how to be present in a room with another person. She should have placed the letter on the table between them the way he had placed the ledger. She didn't. She told herself she needed time to think. That was true. She told herself it wasn't the right moment. That was less true. The deeper truth, the one she was not fully ready to examine, was that she was afraid of what the letter would change, not the money, not the inheritance, but the way he would look at her once she told him there was an alternative, once he knew that she had options now. Once he understood that the necessity that had brought her to Wyoming had dissolved. She was afraid he would start looking at her like a woman who was leaving. And she was afraid this was the truth underneath the truth. That once he started looking at her that way, she would not be able to talk him out of it. Because Nathan Brooks had been abandoned by life enough times, had been left enough times in enough ways, that his first response to any threat of another departure would be to create distance before the distance was created for him. She knew this about him. She'd learned him. So she kept the letter in the drawer, and she passed the supper, and she answered his questions about the fall drive with the appropriate precision, and she went to bed that night, and lay awake for a long time, listening to the house settle around her. Tell him, she thought. Tell him tomorrow. Tomorrow came and went. Nathan found it on a Thursday, not intentionally. He was not a man who went through his wife's belongings, and this was not something he'd done, and it was not something he'd have done under ordinary circumstances. But Emma had asked him that morning to find her small ledger, the household accounts, which she said she thought she'd left in the nightstand, and he'd gone to look for it while she was in the garden, and the nightstand drawer had two things in it, the ledger which he took, and the letter which fell out when the ledger caught the envelope's edge. He would have left it. He genuinely would have left it on the floor and picked it up and put it back and thought nothing of it. But the seal was face up, Harrington and Graves, Missouri, and below it in the formal font of legal correspondence, re-estate of Gerald L. Harper, secondary beneficiary notification. He stood there. He did not read the whole letter. He read enough. He read the word substantial. He read 60 days to respond. He read your return to Missouri would facilitate the transfer process. He put the letter back in the drawer. He took the ledger. He went back downstairs. He stood in the kitchen for a moment. Then he went outside. Emma found him at the south fence that afternoon, which was where he went when he needed the particular combination of physical activity and open space that allowed him to contain something too large for walls. She could tell from 20 yards that something had shifted. It was the set of his shoulders, she'd learned. His shoulders the way you learn the particular patterns of weather in a new territory, the small signs that mean something larger is coming. Nathan, she said. Fence needs reinforcing before winter, he said without turning. Nathan. Pete's been meaning to get to this section. I'll do it myself. Stop, she said. He stopped. He didn't turn. You found the letter, she said. A long pause. It fell out, he said. His voice was entirely flat. I wasn't looking for it. I know you weren't. She stayed where she was. I was going to tell you. Were you? Yes. When? The question landed harder than raised voices would have. I needed time to decide what I thought about it first, she said. I wasn't trying to hide it from you. You've had it for... He stopped. He turned then, and his face was the careful, controlled version she hadn't seen since the early weeks, the one with everything locked back down. How long have you had it? She told him the truth. 8 days. 8 days. Nathan, you have an inheritance waiting for you in Missouri, he said. Enough to live on, to live well on. And you didn't tell me. He looked at her with the eyes of a man already processing a loss he hasn't let himself name. Why? Because I was afraid of exactly this, she said. Of the way you're looking at me right now. How am I looking at you? Like I'm already gone. The fence line was very quiet. Nathan turned back to the fence. Aren't you? He said, and his voice had the particular flatness of a man who is being careful not to let it break. No, Emma said. You have money waiting for you. Real money. You wouldn't need... He stopped himself. You wouldn't need a struggling ranch in Wyoming. You wouldn't need a marriage you entered because you had no other options. That's not. I wrote you a letter that described a drafting stove and a leaking roof, he said, and his voice was still flat and still controlled, and it was the control that hurt to listen to, because she could hear what was underneath it. You came because you needed somewhere to go. I understood that. He stopped. I never expected it to be permanent. I didn't expect to... He stopped there. In the gap where he stopped was everything he hadn't said in 3 months. Everything that had been accumulating in the file that was too full to stay closed. You didn't expect to what? Emma said very quietly. Nathan's jaw was tight. He looked at the fence. He looked at the field. He looked at the enormous Wyoming sky that didn't offer anyone any shelter from anything. I didn't expect to need you to stay, he said. The words came out rough and low, and clearly cost him something he didn't have a surplus of. Emma stood very still. Nathan, you should take the inheritance, he said. That's the honest thing to say. You came here with nothing. You don't have to leave with nothing. I don't want to leave at all, she said. You'd be choosing this. He gestured a short, almost angry movement that encompassed the fence, the field, the struggling ranch himself. Over financial security. No reasonable person. I am a reasonable person, she said. And I'm telling you I don't want to leave. Why? He turned to face her fully. Give me a reason I can believe. She looked at him at the carefully held posture and the controlled face, and the eyes that were not she noticed quite as controlled as the rest, and she thought about all the things she could say that were true, and all the things she could say that were safe, and she chose the truth because it was the only thing left that might actually reach him. Because you fixed a water trough that had been broken for 3 years, she said. Because you sat down on that porch step and taught a 14-year-old boy long division like it was the most natural thing in the world. Because you brought me a book of poetry and told Greta Hollis it was practical, and you both knew it wasn't. She paused. Because you said it's not a transaction, and you meant it, and so did I. The fence line was silent. That's not... He stopped. That's not a financial argument. No, she said. It's not. Nathan looked at her for a long time. The controlled face was doing less work than it had been doing a moment ago. Emma, he said. And then he didn't say anything else because whatever came after her name was too large to fit through the opening he had available. I'm not going anywhere, she said. Not unless you tell me to. And I'm asking you directly to not tell me to. A very long silence. A muscle moved in his jaw. I need to think, he said. She nodded. All right. She walked back to the house. He stood at the fence for another hour alone with the sky and the field, and the terrible, unwelcome clarity of a man who has spent 4 years believing that needing someone was a weakness, and has just discovered that what he's afraid of is not loss, but the specific, irreplaceable loss of this one particular person. He didn't come in for supper that evening. Emma set a plate in the warming oven and sat at the kitchen table with her Thoreau and read the same page 4 times without retaining a word of it, and finally gave up and simply sat. At 9 o'clock, she heard the door. Nathan came to the kitchen doorway. He had the look of a man who has made a decision the hard way, not easily, not cleanly, but by going all the way through the difficulty until he came out the other side. The inheritance, he said. She looked up. What you do with it is your decision. I'm not going to have an opinion about it. He held her eyes. But I want you to make the decision you actually want to make, not the one you think... He stopped. Not the one you think I need you to make. That's not what I'm doing, she said. I know. He moved to the table. He didn't sit. He stood across from her with his hands on the back of the chair. I know that. I've known it since the fence line. I just needed... He exhaled. I needed to be sure I was saying the right thing for the right reason. She waited. I don't want you to stay out of obligation, he said. I didn't want obligation when I wrote the letter. I don't want it now. I know, she said, and I don't... He looked at the table. I don't have a lot of practice asking for things. I've been managing alone long enough that asking feels like... He stopped himself, started differently. I'm not good at this. You're doing fine, she said. He looked up. Nathan. She held his eyes. I know what you're trying to say. I think you know what I would answer. I want to hear you say it. I want to stay, she said. Not because I have to. Not because I'm afraid of Missouri. Because I want to be here. Because this... She chose her words carefully, the way he chose his, because this mattered enough to be precise. Because this feels more like home than anywhere I've been since I was a child. Because you feel like... She stopped. Like what? He said, very quietly. Like someone I don't want to stop knowing, she said. Nathan stood with his hands on the back of the chair, and the kitchen lamp throwing its particular light over everything, and something in his face came undone in a very small, very private way, just at the edges, just enough for her to see. He pulled out the chair and sat down. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, not with drama, not with declaration, just with the deliberate certainty of a man who has made up his mind and doesn't do things halfway once he has. Emma turned her hand over and held his. They sat like that for a while, not talking, not needing to. Outside, the August night did what Wyoming August nights do, cooled suddenly, brilliantly, the stars arriving in their thousands, once the day's heat released its grip, and inside the kitchen the lamp burned steady, and two people sat at a table holding hands in the simple, enormous way of people who have just agreed without saying it in words on something permanent. The gossip reached Nathan on a Tuesday. He had been aware in the general way of a man who has lived in a small territory his whole life that people talked. He'd heard the Laramie women in the alley. He'd understood that Emma's origins were known. Mail order was not a secret in a place where everyone read everyone else's correspondence, and the Stagecoach Manifest was essentially public record. What he hadn't anticipated was that the Harper inheritance would become known. He didn't find out until later how it happened, most likely through Harrington and Graves's local representative in Cheyenne, who had apparently mentioned the matter to a land agent in Laramie, who had a wife who knew the wives of half the people in the territory. By the time it reached Nathan, it had passed through enough pairs of hands to be warm with the particular heat of information that has been shaped by telling. He heard it from the banker of all people, Aldous Marsh, who held Nathan's note and had been a fixture of uncomfortable quarterly meetings for the past 3 years. Marsh mentioned it in passing with the studied casualness of a man who considers financial information a legitimate topic of social conversation. "Heard your wife came into some money," Marsh said, reviewing paperwork. "Missouri estate. Substantial, they say." "That's private," Nathan said. Of course. Marsh did not appear chastened. "Just interesting timing. You'll be in a much better position, I imagine, if she decides to invest in the ranch." Nathan looked at him. "She won't be investing in the ranch," Nathan said. "What's mine is mine, and what's hers is hers." Marsh looked up, surprised by this. "That seems, practically speaking." "That's how it is," Nathan said. He rode home. He told Emma about the conversation that evening, because they had, since the south fence and the kitchen table and the held hands, moved to a place of telling each other things. It was a deliberate choice on both their parts, and it required daily maintenance the way good fences do, but it was holding. Emma listened to the Marsh account. "People know about the letter," she said. "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "And what they're saying is that you married a struggling rancher and now you have money, and the natural next step is to leave," he said, Flat, direct, the way he'd learned to say difficult things since the south fence line. "That's what they said when you were in the alley in June, too," Emma said. He looked at her. "Hector told me," she said. "2 women said I only married you because I had no options, that Margaret was a real wife and I was just practical." She met his eyes. "You didn't tell me. I didn't want it to." He stopped. "To hurt me. To matter to you." "Nathan?" She held his gaze steadily. "It matters because it's about you too. About what people think of you." She paused. "They think you don't know. They think you're being fooled by a woman using you until something better arrived." The words spoken plainly landed with the full weight they deserved. "And what do you want to do about it?" he said. Emma was very still for a moment. "Nothing," she said. "There is nothing to do about what people think. There is only what's true." She looked at him. "What's true is that I'm staying. What's true is that the inheritance is mine to decide about, and I haven't decided yet, and when I do, the decision won't be made to prove anything to Laramie." He studied her. "You've thought about this." "I've thought about a lot of things," she said. "I think about most things." "What are you thinking about doing with it?" he asked. "The inheritance. If you could do anything." She hesitated. Then, "There are children in this territory who don't have schools. The Caldwell children, the Morrison children, Cal, who was 14 and barely reading, because there was no teacher within reasonable distance. There are women, widows, women whose husbands left or died or disappeared, who have nothing and no place to go and no skill the territory recognizes as valuable." She paused. "Money like that could build a school, could provide for women who need a start the way I needed a start." Nathan was quiet. "And you," he said. "What about your start?" "I have mine," she said, simply, without performance. He held her eyes for a long moment, and then something shifted in his face. Not the controlled unlocking she'd seen at the south fence, but something deeper. Something that had been forming for 3 months underneath all the managed silences and the careful distances and the deliberate accounting of a man who loved a thing before he was ready to call it that. "Emma," he said. "Nathan, I need to say something, and I need to say it badly, and I've been—" He stopped. He looked at his hands. He looked back at her. "I've been practicing saying things I mean since you got here. You're aware of that. You've been patient with how long it takes me." "Yes," she said. "I'm not good at—" He stopped himself because he'd said that before and she'd told him he was doing fine. He started again. "What I'm trying to say is that when I found that letter in that moment before I could stop myself from imagining you gone, what I felt was not about the ranch." He paused. "It was about you." Emma did not move. "I know it's too soon," he said. "I know 3 months is not— I know what we started as. I know the terms I set. I know every reasonable argument for why I shouldn't be—" He stopped. "I am anyway." The kitchen was completely still. "Say it," Emma said, very quietly. "I love you," Nathan Brooks said. "I don't know when it happened, and I don't have a story to tell about it because it didn't happen in a moment. It happened in coffee at a lower shelf, and biscuits for the hands, and long division on a porch step, and 14 mason jars, and you standing at the east fence in a lightning storm." He was looking at her directly the way he looked at fences that needed assessing, and numbers that needed to be true. "It happened in all of it. I love you. I have no expectation that—" "Nathan," she said. He stopped. "I love you too," she said. "I don't have a story either. Just a rocking chair and a book of poetry, and a man who told me the truth when he had no reason to." Her voice held, but just barely. "I love you." The kitchen held its breath. Nathan stood up from the table. He crossed to her side, and she stood to meet him, and he took her face in his hands, with the particular care of a man who is holding something he spent months telling himself he didn't want, and has only now allowed himself to admit is the most important thing he possesses. He kissed her. Not the impersonal contact of the parlor at Reverend Douglas's parsonage. Something entirely different. Something that meant everything that had been sitting in the file for 3 months opened at last. She held onto his arms and kissed him back, and the lamp burned between them, and outside the August stars did their abundance, and the ranch that had been silent for 4 years held the sound of two people remembering what it felt like to not be alone. So, neither of them knew in those warm August evenings with their held hands and their shared ledgers and their slowly lowering guards that the hardest part was still coming, that the gossip had not finished with them, that the letter from Missouri was about to become more complicated, that two people who have just found each other are exactly as vulnerable as two people who haven't, because now there is something real to lose. They didn't know any of that yet. What they knew was the coffee in the morning, the voices in the kitchen, the children on Saturday, the ranch they were building together one careful day at a time. They held on to that. Right up until the morning it wasn't enough. The morning it stopped being enough arrived on a Wednesday in the second week of September, and it arrived the way the worst things always do, quietly in an envelope, before Nathan had finished his first cup of coffee. Emma was already at the table when he came downstairs. She had the letter in her hand. Not the Harrington and Graves letter, that one she'd dealt with in her own way, in her own time, and he didn't know yet what she'd decided. This was a different letter. Smaller envelope, cheaper paper, the handwriting urgent in the way of someone who had written quickly and without care for impression. She looked up when he walked in, and her face told him everything before the words did. "It's from a woman named Clara Voss," Emma said. "She was Daniel's cousin, third cousin actually. I met her once at Christmas years ago." She set the letter on the table between them. "She's the primary beneficiary of the Harper estate. She's contesting my inclusion." Nathan sat down. He reached for the letter. "On what grounds?" he said. "She's claiming that Daniel and I were separated at the time of his death, that the marriage was functionally dissolved, and I have no legitimate claim as a surviving spouse." Emma's voice was steady, but Nathan had learned her steadiness by now. He knew the difference between the steadiness of calm and the steadiness of someone holding a great deal of controlled weight. This was the second kind. "She has a lawyer in Kansas City. They're prepared to take it to court if necessary." Nathan read the letter. It was brief and precise and designed to frighten the kind of letter that people with money send to people they believe have less resolve than funds. Every sentence in it was technically a question while functionally being a threat. "Were you separated?" he asked. "No." Emma met his eyes directly. "We had difficulties. Every marriage has difficulties. But we were not separated. We were in the same house until the week he died." "Then she has no case." "She might not need a case." Emma folded her hands on the table. "She needs delay. If she contests and the estate goes into litigation, the process could take months, years. Harrington and Graves' letter already asked for a response within 60 days. If there's a contest, those 60 days become—" She stopped. "It becomes complicated." Nathan set the letter down. He looked at her for a moment, at the controlled steadiness that was costing her something, and then he did the thing he'd been doing since August, since the south fence and the kitchen table and the held hands. He reached across and put his hand over hers. "All right," he said. "Nathan, we'll get Douglas to write a statement. He has contacts in Cheyenne who practice estate law. We'll document everything from your side and respond to Harrington and Graves before the 60 days are up with a clear record." He paused. "This is manageable." Emma looked at him. "You don't have to—" she started. "Emma." His voice was quiet and entirely certain. "Stop telling me what I don't have to do." She was silent for a moment. Then she turned her hand over and held his, and he felt the held weight in her release just slightly, just enough to know she'd been carrying more of it than she'd let on. "She's going to make it ugly," Emma said. "Clara Voss. She's going to say things about why I married Daniel, and why I left Missouri, and why I—" She stopped. "She's going to say things about this. About us." "Let her," Nathan said. "People in this town already have opinions about us. One more won't change anything that's true. It will change what people think. People think what they want regardless." He held her eyes. "What matters is what's true." Emma looked at him steadily. "When did you become the one saying that—" I learned it from someone, he said. Reverend Douglas came to the ranch on Friday, which was not something he'd ever done before. Nathan had always gone to him, and the fact of his making the trip told Nathan something about how seriously the Reverend was taking the situation. He sat across from them at the kitchen table with his hands around a coffee cup and listened to Emma explain the Voss letter with the patient, complete attention of a man who has been in the business of other people's crises for 40 years. Clara Voss, he said when she finished. You know her, Emma said. I know of the Harpers. Daniel's family had connections here through the Territorial Land Office. His father held a surveyor's commission for a period. The Reverend looked at the letter. This is a strategy, not a claim. She's hoping the cost of defending frightens you into settling. I know, Emma said. The question is whether you want to fight it or negotiate it. Fight it, Nathan said. Both the Reverend and Emma looked at him. She's not settling with someone who has no legitimate claim, Nathan said. We document what's true, we submit it properly, and if Clara Voss wants to take it to a court, she'll find out what a losing argument costs in Kansas City. The Reverend studied him for a moment. You've thought about this. I've thought about it since Friday morning. Nathan, Emma started. It's your inheritance, he said. I know that. I know it's your decision. He held her eyes. But you asked me what I thought, and that's what I think. She had not actually asked him, but he was right that she'd wanted to. The school, she said, if the estate clears. I know, he said. I want to use it for a school, and for a fund women who need a start. I've already written the outline for what I'd want it to do. She paused. I haven't told you that part yet. Tell me now, he said. She told him. Reverend Douglas sat across from them and listened to Emma lay out what she'd been thinking in the weeks since the letter arrived, the structure of a small educational fund, a school building, a modest provision for women in the territory arriving in circumstances like the one she'd arrived in. She'd been precise about it. She'd written numbers, projections, the kind of detailed accounting she'd applied to the household ledger and the bread sales and the mason jar preserves. When she finished, the Reverend was quiet for a moment. You'd refuse the personal portion, he said. I'd redirect it, she said. There's a provision for personal retention. I'd take what covers the legal costs of defending the estate and a modest reserve. The rest goes to the fund. Nathan looked at her. You've already decided, he said. I decided 3 weeks ago, she said. I just needed to... She paused. I needed to say it out loud to know if it still felt right. Does it? He said. Yes, she said. Does it make sense to you? He looked at her for a long moment. Yes, he said. It makes complete sense. Reverend Douglas set down his coffee cup. He looked between them with the expression of a man witnessing something he'd hoped for and hadn't been certain of. I'll write to my contact in Cheyenne this afternoon, he said. The legal response went out in the 3rd week of September, documented and precise and co-signed by Reverend Douglas, and 2 witnesses who could attest to Emma's continuous residence and marriage status at the time of Daniel Harper's death. Harrington and Graves acknowledged receipt within a week. Clara Voss's lawyer in Kansas City went quiet. That silence was not peace. Emma knew enough about legal strategy to understand that silence meant regrouping. Not conceding, but it was a pause, and in the pause, life continued its ordinary motion. The fall cattle drive happened. Nathan was gone for 11 days with Hector and Pete, and 2 hired hands driving the season's cattle to Cheyenne for market, and those 11 days were the first significant time Emma had spent alone since arriving in June. She had not expected to feel his absence as physically as she did. She'd been alone before. She'd been alone for 14 months after Daniel died, alone in a way that had been defined by lack of money, lack of direction, lack of anything to build toward. This was a different kind of alone. This was the absence of a specific person, of a specific voice, and a specific set of shoulders, and a specific habit of appearing in doorways when he wanted to say something, and hadn't figured out yet how to say it. She kept the Saturday lessons. She kept the bread baking and the preserve making and the market runs. She kept the household accounts with the same precision she'd maintained since June. She sat in the rocking chair 2 evenings. She'd never sat in it before it had felt like his space, his mother's space, not hers to occupy. But on the 8th evening of his absence, when the house had been quiet long enough to have weight to it, she sat in it, and it held her solidly and without sound. And she looked at the lamp burning on the table, and thought about all the evenings Eleanor Brooks must have sat in this same chair, watching a different lamp, and felt for the first time genuinely and specifically connected to this house. Not just present in it. Connected. She was still sitting in it when she heard the wagon in the yard. She was at the door before he reached it. Nathan came in from 11 days of cattle driving, looking like exactly what he was. Tired, trail-dusted, in need of a meal and a bath and a bed, and he stopped when he saw her in the doorway, and the expression on his face beneath the exhaustion was the particular relief of a man arriving home. "The rocking chair," he said, noticing. "I hope that's all right," she said. "It's your chair," he said. She had not been expecting that. She blinked. "It's your house," he said. "It's your chair. It's your—" He stopped himself because he was tired, and the emotions that travel with exhaustion are less managed than the daytime variety. "I'm glad you were sitting in it." Emma looked at him. "Come inside," she said. "There's supper in the warming oven." He came inside. He sat at the table. She brought him food and coffee and sat across from him, and he told her about the drive and the cattle price and the conversation he'd had with Aldous Marsh's counterpart in Cheyenne, who had indicated that the ranch's note, given the strong fall revenue, was in a position for renegotiation on more favorable terms. "You're going to be all right," she said. "The ranch." "We," he said. She smiled. "We." He reached across the table. She met him halfway. Chapeau. The Voss situation broke open on a Thursday morning in early October. Not the legal situation that was still suspended in its careful silence. What broke was the town's version of it, which had been building since the banker Marsh had mentioned the inheritance, in what he clearly thought of as a private conversation, and which had been circulating in the particular underground current of small territory information exchange ever since. Emma went to market on Thursday, as she always did, bread loaded in the wagon, 2 crates of preserves, and the small confidence that 3 months of consistent, honest dealings had built with the merchants and neighbors of Laramie. What she found at the general store was Greta Hollis, with an expression Emma had not seen on her before, careful, watchful, the expression of a woman who is about to say something she's been arguing with herself about for a while. "There's been talk," Greta said before Emma had set down the first crate. Emma set it down deliberately. "There's always talk." "More than usual." Greta looked at her directly, which was one of the things Emma had always respected about her. "Someone's been saying that you're planning to leave before winter, that the inheritance money is enough and there's nothing to keep you on a struggling ranch once you have it." Emma was quiet for a moment. "Who's saying that?" "It started at the bank," Greta said. "I think you can work out the rest of the chain." Aldous Marsh. Emma had never particularly trusted the man. There was something in the way he spoke about Nathan's finances, with the comfortable ownership of a person who considers debt a form of authority over the debtor. She'd felt it at the quarterly meeting she'd attended with Nathan in September. She'd said nothing at the time. "Is that what people believe?" Emma said. "That I'm leaving?" Greta was quiet for a moment. "Some do," she said. "Some think—" She stopped. "Emma, some people thought from the beginning that this was temporary, that a woman who comes to a territory she doesn't know to marry a man she's never met is doing it as a bridge, until something better arrives." "And what do you think?" Emma said. Greta met her eyes. "I think you're the reason that ranch is still solvent, and the reason 4 ranch children are learning to read, and the reason Nathan Brooks smiles at all, which he didn't used to do." She paused. "I think you belong here, but belonging here doesn't stop other people from deciding you don't." Emma stood at the counter of the general store and held this information. "I'm not leaving," she said. "I know that," Greta said. "How do you know that?" Because if you were leaving, Greta said, with the particular dry certainty of a woman who has run a general store in a small territory for 20 years and knows every human variation that passes through it, you'd already be gone. Emma did not tell Nathan about the market conversation immediately. She drove home, unloaded the wagon, put the revenue in the tin box, and made supper, and sat across from him and talked about the Thursday afternoon in the ordinary register they'd established. And it was only when he looked at her across the table with the particular direct attention that meant he'd noticed something was wrong that she stopped and set down her fork. "Greta Hollis told me people think I'm leaving," she said. Nathan set down his fork. "Before winter," Emma continued. "Once the inheritance clears. That's the story. That I was here until something better arrived, and now it has." He was quiet. "It started at the bank," she said. "Marsh," he said. Flat. "Yes." Nathan's jaw was tight. She watched him process it the particular way he processed things that made him angry, which was with a controlled internal compression that was more dangerous in some ways than outward anger. "I'll go to Laramie tomorrow," he said. "Nathan, I'm not going to let a banker spread stories about my wife without me, Nathan." She held his eyes. "What would you say to him?" He stopped. "What would you say that would change what people already believe?" she said. "The story is already out. Going to Marsh's office and making demands only confirms to the whole town that there's a reason for demands to be made." He looked at her. The compression was still there, but he was listening. "Then what?" he said. She picked up her fork. She set it back down. She had been thinking about this for the entire drive home, and the answer she'd arrived at was not complicated, but it required something from him that she couldn't ask for directly. She could only create the conditions for it and see whether he chose it. "Nothing," she said. "We do nothing. We continue exactly as we are. The truth is the truth. It doesn't require defense." He was quiet for a long time. "I hate that," he said. "I know," she said. "I do too." "You've done nothing wrong," he said. He stopped. She could see him choosing between the managed version and the true one. He chose the true one. "You've given this ranch everything you had, and you've done it honestly and without complaint. And the idea that people are sitting in Laramie deciding you're using me—" He stopped again. The compression was in his voice now. "It makes me want to do something I know isn't useful." "The best thing you can do," she said quietly, "is exactly what you've been doing. Show up. Work the ranch. Let the ranch speak." "The ranch isn't the one being talked about." "No," she said. "I am. And I'm asking you to trust me to know how to handle it." A very long silence. "All right," he said. "Thank you," she said. He looked at her for another moment, and she could see that trusting her to handle it cost him something, because protecting was the instinct of a man who had failed to protect before, and lived with that. She wanted to say something about that about Margaret, about the things he'd never said to her directly, but this was not the evening for it, and she let it rest. She reached across and touched his hand briefly. He turned it over and held hers for a moment, and then they both picked up their forks and finished supper. What neither of them knew was that across town, Clara Voss's lawyer had sent a second letter, not to Emma, to Harrington and Graves directly. The second letter contained a piece of information the lawyer had apparently obtained through whatever means lawyers in Kansas City obtain information, which is to say, through the meticulous and relentless process of looking for any weakness in a position they want to undermine. The information was this. Emma Harper had been employed as a teacher in Springfield for 3 years. During those 3 years, she had on 2 separate occasions been involved in the administration of small charitable funds connected to her school. Both funds had been managed with complete integrity. This was not a corruption allegation. But the existence of these funds, the lawyer argued, demonstrated that Emma Harper had a pattern of associating herself with financial resources that were not her own, and directing them toward outcomes she had predetermined without adequate consultation with the actual stakeholders. It was an argument so tenuous, it was almost an embarrassment. But it would be made, and it would be documented, and it would be attached to a court filing if Harrington and Graves did not advise Emma to settle. Harrington and Graves sent a forwarded copy to Emma in early October with a carefully worded note advising her to consider her options. Emma read the letter at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning when Nathan was in the North Field. Then she read it again. The anger she felt was clean and specific. Not at Clara Voss exactly. Clara Voss was doing what people do when they believe money belongs to them by proximity and are willing to work to retrieve it. The anger was at the mechanism. At the way the lawyer had taken the thing Emma was most genuinely proud of, 3 years of honest teaching, 2 small funds managed with scrupulous care for children who had nothing, and reframed it as evidence of predatory intent. At the way goodness could be picked up and turned around to look like something else entirely, if you held it at the right angle in bad light. She sat with the letter for a long time. Then she did something that surprised her. She got up, walked to Nathan's desk in the small room off the front parlor where he kept the ranch's official records, and she took out a sheet of paper and a pen, and she wrote to Harrington and Graves. Not to negotiate. Not to settle. She wrote to instruct them to proceed with the defense of her claim to document the Springfield teaching funds in full, and submit them to the court with complete transparency, and to make clear to Clara Voss's lawyer that she was prepared to let a court examine every financial decision she'd ever made because she had nothing to fear from examination. She sealed the letter. She addressed it. She set it on the hall table to go with the next post. Then she went back to the kitchen and made bread because it was Tuesday, and bread was what Tuesdays required. And she worked the dough with her hands, with the particular vigor of a woman who has just made a decision she's certain of. Nathan found the letter on the hall table when he came in. He recognized the address. He picked it up and looked at Emma, who was setting supper on the table. "Second letter from Voss's lawyer," she said. I wrote back. He looked at the sealed envelope. "What did you say?" "I told them to proceed. Full documentation. Open court if it comes to that." She set the last plate down. "I'm not settling." He was quiet for a moment. "All right," he said. "All right." She looked at him. "I told you in September," he said, setting the letter back down. "She has no legitimate claim. Let a court say so." Emma looked at him. "You're not going to tell me to be careful," she said. "To think about the costs, the time, I've thought about it," he said. "You've thought about it more than I have. You made the right call." He met her eyes. "When have you made the wrong one?" She stood at the table and held his gaze, and felt something she'd been bracing against, release some last remaining tension in the structure of what they were to each other, some last testing point. He had just told her he trusted her judgment, not conditionally, not with qualification, just directly in the plain language of a man who means what he says. "Sit down," she said. "Supper's getting cold." He sat. They ate. The thing that happened next happened because of Hector, not because Hector intended it. Hector was as he always was, trying to do the right thing. But Hector had been listening in the particular way of a man who spends a great deal of time outdoors, and therefore hears conversations that happen near open windows. And what he'd heard on a Tuesday morning in mid-October was Emma at Nathan's desk, reading the Voss letter aloud to herself, in the way people read difficult things, quietly processing, and then the decisive sound of pen on paper and the particular firmness of an envelope sealed. He'd heard enough to understand the shape of it. And Hector, who had 9 years of investment in Nathan Brooks's well-being, and 3 months of investment in Emma Brooks's well-being, did something he would normally never do. He talked. He talked at the bunkhouse that evening. Not extensively, just enough. He told Pete and the 2 seasonal hands that Mrs. Brooks had gotten a lawyer's letter trying to take money that was rightfully hers, and she'd told them to go ahead and take it to court because she had nothing to hide. He said it the way he said most things, briefly, without drama, with the authority of a man who was reporting a fact. By Friday, it had moved through 4 separate conversations beyond the bunkhouse. By the following Tuesday, Greta Hollis had mentioned it to 2 customers. By the Thursday of that week, What the town of Laramie knew was no longer the banker's version, the woman waiting to leave once the money cleared. What it knew was a different story. A woman who'd been offered enough to leave and had instead filed legal documents refusing to be intimidated. A woman who'd told a Kansas City lawyer to take her to court because she had nothing to be ashamed of. It was the same territory, the same woman, but the light had shifted. Emma found out about this when Greta Hollis greeted her on Thursday morning with something different in her expression. "Word got around," Greta said. Emma looked at her. "About the legal response. About what you did." Greta leaned on the counter. "About what you're doing with the money. The school fund. The provision for women." She paused. "Martha Caldwell told the Reverend's wife. The Reverend's wife told half the church. By Sunday, I imagine the Reverend himself will have something to say about it." Emma stood with a crate of bread in her hands. "I wasn't trying to," she started. "I know you weren't," Greta said. "That's why it spread." Reverend Douglas did have something to say about it. He said it on a Sunday from the pulpit without naming names, which everyone understood was a courtesy, since everyone knew exactly who he was talking about. He spoke about practical charity, about the difference between the kind of generosity that announces itself and the kind that simply does what needs to be done. He spoke about the school that the territory needed and the women who arrived in circumstances that required not pity, but provision. He spoke about two people who had entered a practical arrangement and chosen every day to make it something more than practical. Nathan was in the third pew. Emma was beside him. He did not look sideways at her during the sermon. He looked forward, which was how he absorbed things that moved him without visible reaction, processing inward with the stillness of a man who has learned that emotion is most safely experienced alone. But his hand found hers in the space between them on the pew, and he held it without drama for the remainder of the service, and Emma held back, and nobody in that church who saw them thought for a moment that what they were looking at was temporary. The legal resolution from Harrington and Graves arrived in the last week of October. Clara Voss had withdrawn the contest. Not because she'd been persuaded by the merits, she hadn't, but the full documentation Emma had authorized had been submitted, and what it contained was clean and complete, and entirely without the exploitable edges that a Kansas City lawyer needed to build a case on, and the cost of taking something genuinely solid to court was more than Clara Voss had appetite for. The letter confirmed the estate would proceed as written. Emma read it at the kitchen table on a Wednesday morning. Nathan was in the barn. She could hear him moving around out there, the familiar sounds of a man and his work in the early morning. She sat with the letter and the quiet and the October light coming in the kitchen window, and she thought about Springfield and the westbound ticket and the single suitcase and the letter that had described a drafting stove honestly. She thought about 37 days and the 38th. She thought about the south fence and the mason jars and the east fence line in a lightning storm. She thought about a man saying, "I love you," by describing coffee on a lower shelf and chalk on his hands, because he didn't have flowery language and had never pretended otherwise. She folded the letter and went to the barn. Nathan was checking harness leather the way he did in the autumn before winter set in. He looked up when she appeared in the doorway. She held out the letter. He took it. He read it. He looked up. "It's done," she said. He set the harness down. "Clara Voss withdrew," Emma said. "The estate proceeds." Nathan stood across from her in the barn, with the October morning around them, and looked at her with the particular expression she'd learned over 5 months, the one that meant he was feeling something larger than his management of it. "Are you—" he started. "I'm good," she said. "I'm very good." "The school fund," he said. "I'll write to Harrington and Graves this week, redirect everything above the legal costs and the reserve." She paused. "The reserve I'd like to put in the household account, if that's all right. Not the ranch account. The household." He looked at her. "Why the household?" "Because it's ours," she said. "Not mine, not yours. Ours." A silence. He crossed the barn to her in 4 steps and took her face in his hands and kissed her the way he'd kissed her in August with the full weight of everything in the file, everything accumulated, everything no longer managed or held at deliberate distance. She held on to him and kissed him back, and when they finally separated, she was smiling. And so was he, actually smiling completely with nothing held back. And it was the smile she'd been watching him find his way back to since June, emerging first in the kitchen, and then on the porch with Cal. And then by slow degrees in the evenings, and the early mornings, and the hard conversations. And here it was now whole. "Come inside," she said. "I'll make coffee." "You always make coffee," he said. "And you always drink it," she said. "We're very consistent." He laughed. She would think about that laugh later, the way it filled the barn, and then the yard, and then the kitchen where she made coffee. And he sat at the table, and the October morning held them both as one of the sounds she would want to keep if she could only keep a few. She made coffee. He drank it. And outside the ranch, kept doing what it had been doing all summer, and into fall, not dramatically, not with announcement, but with the steady accumulating evidence of two people who had chosen to build something real and had not once in all the difficult weeks that tested them chosen to put it down. The first snow of the season came on a Friday morning in early November, and Nathan noticed it the way he noticed most things now, not alone, but in relation to Emma. She was already at the stove when he came downstairs, and she turned when she heard him and said, "It's snowing," with the particular tone of someone reporting a fact that is also a pleasure. And he looked at her face before he looked at the window, which told him everything about how November had changed from every November before it. "Light snow," he said, going to the window. "Won't stick past noon." "Cal is going to be disappointed," she said. "He's been wanting to try the sleigh runners Hector found in the storage shed." "Cal is 19 and shouldn't need snow as an excuse to do something foolish," Nathan said, and poured his coffee from the pot she'd already made, still on the lower shelf. Still exactly where it had been since the first week, a small constant that had become one of the anchors of his mornings. Emma smiled at the stove. He saw it in the set of her shoulders before he saw her face. This was one of the things the year had given him, the ability to read her in increments, in small angles, in the slight variations of posture and voice that were invisible to anyone who hadn't been paying attention since June. He had been paying attention since June. He had been paying attention to almost nothing else. He sat at the table. She brought her own coffee and sat across from him. "The school trust papers came yesterday," she said. "From Harrington and Graves. They need 2 signatures, mine and a territorial administrator's. Reverend Douglas says Judge Albright in Cheyenne will sign as administrator. He's already spoken with him." "When do you need to go to Cheyenne?" "Douglas thinks he can arrange it for next week." She looked at her coffee cup. "I'd like you to come." He looked up. "You don't have to," she said, in the tone she used when she was about to tell him she didn't need something she did in fact need. "I'll come," he said. She looked up. The expression on her face was the one he'd been cataloging all year, the one she kept controlled in public and let him see in private, the one that meant she'd been prepared to be told no, and had not expected yes, and was absorbing the yes with the careful gratitude of a woman who had learned not to take things for granted. "Good," she said, and then more quietly, "Thank you." "Stop thanking me," he said. "Stop making it necessary," she said. He almost smiled. She saw it and did smile, and they sat with their coffee in the Friday morning quiet, while outside the snow came down in the light, inconclusive way of first snows not committing, just suggesting winter was on its way. The trip to Cheyenne happened on a Wednesday and Thursday, 2 days that Nathan would remember not for the legal formality of the trust documents, though that was significant and permanent, and exactly what Emma had said it would be, but for what happened in the hours around the formality. They rode the stage together, which meant 8 hours of proximity in a coach with 2 other passengers, a rancher from Carbon County named Willis and his wife, who introduced themselves with the open friendliness of people who travel well. Within 20 minutes, Willis's wife, a comfortable woman named June, had established that Emma was a teacher, that Nathan raised cattle, that they'd been married since June, and that they were headed to Cheyenne to establish a school trust. "A school trust," June said, with the particular warmth of a woman who has children and therefore has opinions about schools. "How wonderful. For which school? One that doesn't exist yet, Emma said. June blinked. I'm establishing the fund first, Emma said. The school follows. In this territory, you build the foundation before you build the building. Willis, who had been quiet until this point, leaned forward slightly. That's a practical approach, he said. He sounded like he meant it. She's practical, Nathan said. Emma looked at him. He was looking out the window in the studied way he had when he was saying something that mattered and didn't want to make too much of it. In the best sense, he added, still looking at the window. Willis glanced between them with the faint smile of a man who has been married long enough to know what he was looking at. He caught his wife's eye. She returned the expression. Neither of them said anything about it. Some things are better appreciated quietly. Judge Albright's office was compact and orderly, and smelled of old paper and wood oil, and the judge himself was a small dry man in his 60s who had the efficient precision of someone who had processed a great many documents in a long career and had learned to identify the ones that mattered. He read the trust papers twice. Emma sat across from his desk with her hands folded composed. Nathan sat beside her. Reverend Douglas, who had ridden up separately the day before, sat to Emma's left and provided the clerical attestation the trust required. When the judge looked up from the papers, he looked at Emma directly. The beneficiary class, he said. Widows and children of the Wyoming Territory with insufficient access to formal education. No income threshold. No threshold, Emma said. Need is the only qualification. The administrative structure you've named Reverend Douglas as initial trustee. With a succession provision, Emma said. The trust can't depend on any one person. Douglas was willing to serve as initial trustee because he has existing relationships with the families most likely to need it, but the trust continues regardless of who administers it. The judge looked in the papers again. The fund amount is substantial for this territory. Yes, Emma said. And the personal retention. He found the line. This is your entire personal retention, legal fees, and a household reserve. Yes. He looked up. He looked at Nathan. You're comfortable with this arrangement? Nathan held the judge's gaze. It's her money, Judge, her decision. That's not quite what I asked. Yes, Nathan said. I'm comfortable with it. The judge held his gaze for a moment longer, in the way of a man taking a measurement. Then he looked back at the papers, uncapped his pen, and signed. The scratch of pen on paper was brief and permanent. Emma exhaled, not dramatically, not with tears, just a single, quiet release of breath that Nathan heard, and that told him exactly what this moment cost her and exactly what it was worth. He reached over and put his hand on hers, on top of the desk in front of the judge and the reverend, and whoever else might be watching. She turned her hand over and held his. Congratulations, Mrs. Brooks, Judge Albright said. That's a real thing you've just done. Yes, Emma said. It is. They stayed the night in Cheyenne at a small hotel the Reverend had recommended, and over supper, Nathan did something he hadn't done in 5 months of growing closer to this woman. He asked her about Daniel, not combatively, not with the particular male discomfort of a man asking about a predecessor out of insecurity. He asked because they were sitting across from each other at a supper table in a hotel in Cheyenne, on the evening that her trust had been signed, and the conversation had moved through the practical and into the personal. In the easy way it moved now, and Daniel Harper had been present in the background of everything, the estate, the trust, the woman Emma had become in the years of that marriage, and Nathan understood that avoiding him was its own kind of dishonesty. What was he like? Nathan said. Emma looked up. She read his face. He could see her reading it, assessing his tone, deciding what the question was actually asking. Careful, she said finally. Cautious. He had a great deal of anxiety about things he couldn't control, which made him try very hard to control things he could. She paused. He was not unkind. He was just he needed things to stay exactly as they were, and I kept wanting them to be different, better, larger. She looked at her plate. I don't think he knew how to be married to someone who wanted things to grow. Nathan was quiet. "Did you love him?" he said. "Yes," she said. "In the beginning. And then for a long time I loved what I'd hoped he'd become, which is a different thing." She met his eyes. "Do you know the difference?" "Yes," he said. "I do." He thought about Margaret. He thought about the years after Margaret, the way he'd spent them maintaining a grief so carefully it had become a residence, a place he'd chosen to live because the alternative required something he hadn't been ready to give. He thought about a woman who had arrived with one suitcase and had made him ready without intending to one ordinary day at a time. "Margaret," Emma said, not a question. "She was good," he said. "She was genuinely good. Warm, generous the way some people are born with a capacity for warmth that doesn't need to be learned." He looked at the table. "I loved her without reservation. I've spent 4 years wondering if that kind of thing happens twice." Emma was very still. "Does it?" she said. He looked up at her. "I don't know if it happens the same way twice," he said. "This isn't the same, what we have." He held her eyes. "It's not the same as what I had with Margaret. It's—" He paused, choosing his words with the precision he brought to everything that mattered. "It's made of different things. Sturdier things, maybe. Built slower, out of harder materials." She looked at him for a long moment. "I think that's the truest thing you've ever said to me," she said. "I've been working up to it," he said. She laughed. Not the small, contained version she used in public, but the full one. The one he'd heard directed at the children on the porch and had been storing since the first Saturday he'd seen it. He heard it land in the middle of his chest, the same way it always did, and decided he was never going to get accustomed to it, and that this was exactly the right outcome. They came home on Thursday evening to a ranch that had been managed in their absence by Hector with the quiet competence of a man who has kept things running through worse than 2 days. Hector met them at the barn, with the particular expression he wore when he had news, and wasn't sure of its reception. "Something happened," Nathan said. "Not a question." "Nothing bad," Hector said quickly. "Cal brought 3 new students Saturday. Kids from the Dawson spread 2 miles further out than he came from. He apparently recruited them himself." He paused. "He told their parents Mrs. Brooks was the best teacher in the territory." Emma stepped down from the wagon. "He told their parents that," she said. "Those were his words," Hector said. "I wasn't there, but Pete was. Said Cal made quite a speech about it." Emma looked at Nathan. Nathan looked at Emma. "He's going to need more slate boards," Nathan said. "I'll order them from Greta on Saturday," Emma said. They went inside. November built on itself the way good months do, each week adding something to what had been established, deepening what was already there rather than changing its nature. The school trust became known throughout the territory, with a speed that suggested people had been waiting for exactly this kind of thing, and recognized it immediately when it arrived. Reverend Douglas received 3 inquiries in the first 2 weeks from families who wanted to understand what the trust could provide for their children. A woman in Carbon County, a widow with 4 children, and no schooling beyond the 8th grade herself, wrote to Emma directly. She didn't know how she'd gotten Emma's name, but she'd gotten it asking whether the trust might help her children reach something beyond what the territory currently offered. Emma wrote back the same week. She described what the trust could provide. She described the Saturday lessons and what they'd grown into. She told the woman that the trust was not charity, but provision, a distinction she was particular about, and that the only qualification was genuine need and genuine effort. The Carbon County woman wrote again a month later. Her eldest had started reading properly for the first time. Emma pinned the letter above her desk in the small corner of the bedroom she'd claimed as a writing space. Nathan saw it there one evening and stood reading it with his shoulder against the doorframe. "She's the first one," Emma said from the chair. "Not the last," he said. "No," she said. "Not the last." He looked at the letter for another moment, then at Emma. Then he went back downstairs, and Emma sat in her chair with the lamp burning and felt with a completeness that left no room for the old uncertainties that she was in the right place and doing the right thing and living the right life. The twist arrived in December, and it arrived in a form no one had predicted. Cal came to the ranch on a Wednesday, not a Saturday lesson day, which was itself notable, and he came with his hat in his hands and the particular expression of a 19-year-old who has made a decision and is not entirely sure of its reception, but is going to say it anyway because he's reached the age where he's decided that saying things matters more than protecting himself from the response. Emma was in the kitchen. Nathan was at the table with the ledger. Both of them looked up when Hector showed Cal in. "I want to go to school," Cal said. "Real school, not just Saturday lessons." He looked at Emma. "There's a school in Laramie that teaches to the level of a teaching certificate. I asked about it." He swallowed. "I want to be a teacher." The kitchen was very quiet. Cal looked at Nathan because Nathan was the one who employed him, and Nathan's opinion therefore carried a weight that other people's opinions didn't. "I know I'd have to leave the ranch," Cal said. "I know the timing's not ideal. I know winters." "When does the term start?" Nathan said. Cal blinked. "January, second week." Nathan looked at the ledger. He looked at Emma. She was looking at Cal with an expression Nathan had never seen on her before, not the teacher's careful encouragement, not the maternal warmth she showed the younger children. Something more personal than that. Something that looked from where he was sitting like recognition. "I'll need to replace you on the ranch," Nathan said. "Yes, sir. Pete can cover your duties. He's been ready for more responsibility." Nathan closed the ledger. "The school costs, have you looked at what it costs?" "Yes, sir. It's—" Cal named the figure. It was modest by some standards and not by his. "There's a provision in the trust for exactly that," Emma said. She was very controlled, very precise. "Educational advancement for residents of the territory who demonstrate ability and genuine need. You qualify on both." Cal stared at her. "Mrs. Brooks, I'd need your application by Friday," she said. "Reverend Douglas administers the disbursements. He'll need documentation of your enrollment and the cost breakdown." Cal continued staring. "Cal," Nathan said. Cal looked at him. "Close your mouth," Nathan said. "And thank Mrs. Brooks. Cal stopped. He turned back to Emma. He opened his mouth, and whatever he'd prepared to say, the prepared version of it, didn't come out. What came out instead was entirely unplanned. "You're the reason I know I can do this." His voice was rough. "You sat on that porch and you didn't give me the answer. You waited and you let me find it, and you were the first person who ever—" He stopped. He was 19 years old and doing his best. "You're the reason." Emma held herself very together. "Get me the paperwork by Friday," she said. Cal put on his hat. He nodded at Nathan. He went out. The kitchen was quiet. Nathan looked at Emma. She was looking at the table, and she was doing the thing he'd learned to recognize, holding the weight of something large with the controlled steadiness that was not absence of feeling, but the opposite. "Emma," he said. "I'm fine," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm not asking if you're fine, I'm just—" He paused. "Saying your name." She looked up. He met her eyes across the kitchen table with the particular directness that was the truest thing about him, the thing that had been there in the letter about the drafting stove, and had been there every day since the refusal to look sideways at things that deserved to be looked at straight. "You changed that boy's life," he said. "I taught him long division," she said. "You know that's not what I mean." She was quiet. "You've changed a lot of things," he said, "since June." He paused. "Including mine." Emma looked at him steadily. "Including yours," she agreed. Christmas at Brooks Ranch was the first real Christmas the house had seen in 4 years. This was not something Nathan planned. Emma did not announce it. It assembled itself the way things assembled themselves around Emma, through the accumulated effect of a dozen small decisions that each seemed reasonable on their own, and arrived at something larger than anyone had specifically intended. The Caldwell family came for Christmas Eve supper. The Morrison family came. Hector, who had no family in the territory, came with Pete, who did have family, but whose family apparently did not cook as well as Mrs. Brooks, and who had been heard to say as much to Hector with what Pete believed was subtlety, and what everyone else understood was an open statement of intent. Cal came because Cal was still at the ranch until January, and because Cal's family in Texas had not seen him in 3 years, and the distance made the holiday abstract. Reverend Douglas and his wife Clara came because Clara had been waiting since June for an occasion that permitted her to openly demonstrate the affection she'd developed for Emma, and Christmas Eve supper was finally that occasion. 11 people sat at a table and ate and talked and laughed, and the house that had been silent held sound the way a vessel holds water completely without spillage, as though it had been built for exactly this. Nathan sat at the head of the table he'd sat alone at for 4 years, and Emma sat at the other end, and between them the table was full of people who had nothing in common except proximity to 2 lives that had chosen each other. And he looked down that table at her, and she was in the middle of telling Reverend Douglas something about the Carbon County letter with the focused animation she wore when she was talking about something that mattered, and she hadn't looked at him yet. And he held the moment before she did, held the picture of her at the other end of his table in the house. That was her house, among the people that were their people, and felt something complete. She looked up. She found him looking at her immediately the way people do when someone they know has been looking at them. She held his gaze for a moment. She smiled. The real one. The one that changed her face. He held it like something he intended to keep. The question came from Willis of all people. Willis from the stagecoach, who had become over the winter a neighboring acquaintance in the particular way of people who share a territory and a recognition that they've been introduced by circumstance for a reason. Willis and June rode over in early February with a fence line issue that needed a second opinion. And the fence line issue was settled quickly, and then there was coffee at the table, the way there always was. And June was asking Emma about the trust and the Carbon County letter and the school that was now in correspondence with 2 other families, and Willis was watching Nathan watch Emma with the expression of a man putting something together. "You two don't seem like a mail-order arrangement," Willis said bluntly enough that his wife gave him the particular look that wives give husbands who say true things badly. "No," Nathan agreed. "How'd it happen?" Willis said. "The how'd you go from an arrangement to—" He gestured at the kitchen, at the coffee, at whatever the kitchen and the coffee represented. Nathan looked at Emma. Emma looked at Nathan. "We didn't decide to," Emma said. "We decided everything else," Nathan said, "and love was what was left when we stopped deciding." Willis absorbed this. "That's either very simple or very complicated," he said. "Yes," Nathan said. June looked at Emma with the expression of a woman who completely understood and did not need it explained further. Willis drank his coffee. "Good arrangement, then," he said finally. "The best I ever made," Nathan said. Spring came to Brooks Ranch on a Tuesday, as springs do in Wyoming, not gradually, but in a shift a single morning, when the air was different, and the ground was different, and the light had changed its character. Emma found Nathan at the south fence. The south fence she'd watched him stand at in August, the first time the letter had fractured things between them. He was checking the line, methodical as always, hands on the post testing each one. She brought coffee. She'd started doing this in September, bringing coffee to wherever he was when the morning allowed it, and it had become a habit so established that the day she couldn't do it felt like something missing. He heard her coming and didn't look up from the fence. "Loose post on the far end," he said. "Pete can fix it today," she said. "I'll fix it," he said. "Pete's got enough." She stood beside him and handed over the coffee, and he took it and straightened up, and they stood together, looking out at the south field with the spring light on it. "The Dawson children are reading above their grade level," Emma said. "All 3 of them. I tested them last week." "Cal's doing," he said. "Partly. He's been working with them since January, even from Laramie. He writes them letters with vocabulary exercises." She paused. "He's going to be excellent." "You were better," Nathan said. "I'm not competing with my students," she said. "That's not how teaching works." "I know," he said. "I'm just saying." She looked at him sideways. He was looking at the field. The spring was in his face, not in a sentimental way, not posed just the way a man's face holds the season when he's been outside in it long enough to carry it. "A year ago," she said. He looked at her. "A year ago this month I was reading your letter in Springfield," she said. "At a kitchen table I was about to give back to the landlord." She paused. "You wrote about the drafting stove." "I remember," he said. "You wrote, 'I will not waste your time pretending otherwise.'" She met his eyes. "I folded that letter, and I thought, here is an honest man. Whatever else he is or isn't, he's honest." "And," he said. "And I was right," she said. The south fence held them in the quiet. "I wrote that letter," he said slowly, "because I needed help. That's all I was thinking about. How to manage the next season. How to keep what was left." He looked at the field. "I didn't think I wasn't capable of thinking about what else might arrive." "Neither was I," she said. "And now," he said. She looked at him. At the man who had taught long division on a porch step and fixed water troughs that had been broken for 3 years and said, "I love you" by describing coffee on a lower shelf, who had crossed a barn floor in 4 steps when she needed to be reached and had stood beside her at a judge's desk in Cheyenne and said, "It's her money, her decision," with the plainness of a man who meant it entirely. "And now," she said, "I think the most important letters are the honest ones." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he set his coffee cup on the fence post and turned to face her fully, and took her hands in both of his, the way he did when he was about to say something he'd been arranging for a while, and wanted her complete attention. "I want to ask you something," he said. "You're already asking," she said. "I want to ask you properly." He held her hands. He held her eyes. "I know how we started. I know the terms I wrote. I know that a year ago I told you not to expect affection." He paused. "I want to ask you now in front of the south fence and the spring and whatever version of God operates in Wyoming whether you'll stay." "Nathan," she said, "I've been staying. Not because you had to," he said. "Not because the arrangement required it. Because you choose it." He held her gaze with the directness that was the truest thing about him. "I want you to choose it." Emma looked at him. She thought about Springfield and westbound tickets and single suitcases. She thought about drafting stoves and leaking roofs and 2 strangers determined only to survive another season. She thought about coffee on a lower shelf and 14 mason jars and a book of poetry that was not practical and both of them knowing it. She thought about the south fence in August and the kitchen table in September, and a rocking chair that held her solidly and without sound on the 8th night he was gone. She thought about the trust document signed and permanent, about Cal in Laramie with his vocabulary exercises, about a woman in Carbon County whose eldest was reading for the first time, about a table full of people at Christmas in a house that had been silent for 4 years. She thought about a man saying "I love you" by describing the ordinary things that had remade him because he did not have flowery language and had never pretended otherwise, and how that absence of pretense was the foundation of everything they'd built on top of it. "Yes," she said. "Yes, you'll stay," he said, making sure. "Yes," she said. "I choose this. I choose you. I've been choosing you since August, and I'll keep choosing you every day until there are no days left to choose." He held her hands tighter. "Good," he said, rough and low and completely certain. He pulled her in and held her there at the south fence in the spring morning, and she held him back and the ranch they'd built together, not from grand promises or passionate declarations, but from honest letters and lower shelves and long division and 14 mason jars, and the daily deliberate, unglamorous act of choosing held them both. Visitors to Brooks Ranch in the years that followed would often ask how they'd done it. How 2 strangers had made something so solid out of so little to begin with. Nathan always gave the same answer. "We told each other the truth," he'd say. "From the first letter, even when the truth was hard, especially then." Emma would add without looking up from whatever she was doing, "And we showed up." "Every day," Nathan would confirm. "Even the days we didn't want to," she'd say. Especially those, he'd say. And the visitors would nod, and sometimes they'd understand it, And sometimes they wouldn't, because some people hear a love story and wait for the moment of grand passion and miss the real story happening in the quiet. In the coffee, on a lower shelf, in the chalk, on a man's hands. In the east fence line, in a lightning storm, in two people at a kitchen table learning one honest conversation at a time that the most durable thing in the world is not the love that arrives like lightning, but the love that stays like stone. The kind built not from perfect moments, but from imperfect people choosing morning after morning to face whatever comes together. That was the Brooks marriage. That was the Brooks ranch. That was the most solid thing Nathan Brooks ever built, not with lumber or wire or fence posts, but with honesty, patience, and the daily courage to let someone fully in. And it held. It held for the rest of their lives.